Welcome to IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Don.
Coming at you live from San Francisco, California.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Hello, and thank you for watching IT Pro TV, helping you level up with IT learning everywhere you go. I'm your host, Zach Memis, for this episode of CompTIA Linux Plus. This episode, Installing CentOS. And our expert in the field, in the studio, and everywhere he goes, Don Pizzetta is here to show us more. Don, good to see you.
Hey, glad to be here, Zach. And I'm actually pretty excited about this episode because we're going to get a chance to take a look at how to install CentOS. For a lot of people, this is going to be one of the first Linux distributions that you install. It's very, very well regarded in the Linux community, and it's free. You can just go and download it, so there's no barrier to entry. So in this episode, what we're going to do is see how we can get a copy of the CentOS operating system. We'll see how to build an installable media so that we can actually do the install. And then we'll actually run through an install and see all the steps that it takes to get up and running under CentOS 7.
So, Don, can you give us a little background on CentOS?
Sure. So if you're still in that kind of process of selecting which distribution is right for you, CentOS is actually right for a lot of people. It is a free and open source distribution, but it's actually based on Red Hat Enterprise Linux. Now, of all the commercial forms of Linux, in other words, the non-free, Red Hat is the one that generates the most revenue every year. So if you go out into the workplace, you're very likely to find Red Hat systems, either Red Hat Enterprise Linux servers or workstations. They usually call it RHEL, R-H-E-L. And with RHEL, it's not free. You can't just go and download it and install it. You have to buy it. Workstations cost a few $100s a piece per year. Servers cost, I think it's something like $800 per year. So it's non-free. But a lot of you know that Linux is released under the GPL and that it is supposed to be available for free. So what happens is with Red Hat, any code changes that they make to the Linux kernel, they have to return that back to the community. And so they make their source code available to the public. The thing is, if you wanted to run RHEL for free, if you were to take all of that source code and try and compile it yourself, it would be a nightmare. And so what happens is the CentOS community does it. CentOS actually stands for the Community Enterprise Operating System. And what they do is they take all of the source code that Red Hat releases, they remove the Red Hat logos and the Red Hat trademarks because those are all protected property, and then they recompile it under the name of CentOS. And so when you're running CentOS, you're actually running RHEL. It's pretty much the same thing. And if you're wondering whether Red Hat approves or not, don't worry about it because most of the people on the CentOS community are actually Red Hat employees. They actually participate in this because they get a ton of testing and troubleshooting feedback from the community on CentOS, and any improvements there, they bake right into Red Hat. So they make their own commercial product better. They're effectively the same, and you might ask yourself, why would I buy Red Hat if I can just run CentOS for free? Well, if something goes wrong in CentOS, you don't have anybody to call. You can go to the community forum, and that's it.
There's no support.
Yeah, there's no real support, at least not through CentOS themselves.
Right, through CentOS.
But with Red Hat, you can call them up on the phone and say, hey, my machine's acting weird, or I got this video card that's not detecting properly, and they'll actually walk you through the process of fixing it. You do a troubleshooting ticket and all that. So if you want support, which most companies do, Red Hat Enterprise Linux is great. But if you're just learning or running it for yourself, CentOS is great. It's free, it's easy, open source, and you can just download it and get going.
So, Don, what are the minimum requirements to install CentOS?
All right, well, if we go to the CentOS project's webpage, right, so their webpage is www.centos.org. You can jump over there and learn more about the project, but they also post things like the minimum system requirements. And if we look here at what's posted, this is inside of the CentOS wiki. They've got a number of pieces of information in here, but the current version of CentOS is CentOS 7. And they list the minimum requirements, which are actually really, really easy to achieve. So if you come down here to recommended minimum requirements, CentOS 7 and CentOS 6 actually have about the same requirements. So you need a minimum of 392 megs of RAM. Now that's megabytes, not gigabytes. And if you went out today to buy a computer, you'd be pretty hard pressed to find one with less than a gigabyte of RAM at the store. So, this is not really a problem for most people to hit. But if you have older hardware, it's actually very likely that it'll be able to run CentOS just fine. So 392 megabytes, that's if you're just doing the command line install. But if you want to do the graphical install as well, they recommend you have 512 megabytes or half a gigabyte of memory just to make sure the system runs nice and smooth. They also recommend that you have between 10 and 20 gigabytes of hard drive space available to store it. The actual install is less than 10 gigabytes, but they recommend having 20 gigabytes so that you can handle upgrades. When you're doing an upgrade, it downloads a second copy, and you need a little extra room. And that's not including room for your applications and other software. But that's really small. I think if you went to the store, the smallest hard drive you'd probably find these days is likely 250 gigs, maybe 128 gigs. So asking for 10 to 20 gigs is pretty minor. So most of the hardware that's out there on the market today can run CentOS just fine.
So, Don, what can we do to get ready for the install?
All right, well, if we want to get ready for it, there's a few things that we need to do. The first thing is we need to download a copy of CentOS. It's available right on their page. In fact, if I go back to their homepage, you'll see Get CentOS. There's that big button right there at the top. And when you click on that, it takes you to this page where you can download it. There's a couple of different options when you go to download it, the DVD ISO and the minimal ISO. The minimal ISO, like its name implies, is a very stripped down version of CentOS that I think it weighs in somewhere between 500 and 700 megabytes. Very, very small.
Gee.
And it's designed for people that want, let's say you want to deploy a server and you want the server to have the bare minimum features on there, just the stuff that you need, and that's it. You go with the minimal install. It puts the minimum installation, just the bare minimum to get CentOS up and running. And then you can add things like add a web server, add, firewall, whatever it is that you want to add to it. You do that. And now it's running just at the bare minimum. Really great for any kind of security conscious systems. But for everybody else, there's the DVD. The DVD, it actually weighs in at about 5 gigabytes in size. It's pretty big, or 4.7, I think. So it's pretty big. And it has a ton of stuff in there. Things like a graphical user interface and the Open Office suite and so on. All the stuff that most of us are going to want. And so that's the DVD ISO option. And you can click on that to download. And it also has a torrent that you can use to download, which sometimes is a little bit faster. This is a open source free project. So they don't get a lot of funding. They get donations from people. So their download speeds are not the greatest. They rely on mirrors. A lot of local universities will have mirrors of this, so you can download from them. But the torrent pulls from all sorts of people around the world that are handling those files. And so you can pull it from there a lot quicker. But basically, you're going to go here and click on one of these links to download the file. Like I said, if you do the DVD, it's about 4.5 gigs in size. So you've just got to wait for that to download. And once you've got it, now you're ready to get moving and start to do your install. Now, to do the install, most of us are going to use a USB key. And CentOS has published instructions for doing that. And I'll put the links for this inside of the show notes. But basically, what you can do is build a USB key to actually do your installation. And they give you instructions, several different ways to do it. If you already have Linux, well, you can use the DD command from the command line to write that ISO image to a USB key, right? But if we're just installing CentOS, likely we don't have a Linux machine. So what if you're on Windows or on Mac OS? Well, they give instructions for those as well. Somewhere on here, it's kind of a long page. So somewhere on here, what they usually recommend is using a utility called Rufus, which is a strange name for software. But the webpage
Sounds like the name of a dog.
It does, doesn't it? I'm not exactly sure the history on the name on this one, but the tool's been around a long time. It's rufus.ie is the website. And it's just a simple graphical utility. It's designed to run on Windows, and you can pick your USB key that you want to flash, and you can pick the ISO and write it there. All right, so that's what they recommend. Now, I'll tell you personally, I use a different tool. I usually use a tool called Etcher. And Etcher is nice because it runs on Mac, Windows, and Linux. So it's the same process regardless of which operating system you're going to be running. And what it allows you to do is take that ISO and write it to a USB key. So I'm going to go ahead and get that. Actually, do I already have that installed? Let me just see real quick. I do not. So let me go ahead and download and install that. And once we've got it, all we have to do is pick the ISO and write it to a USB key. Now, I happen to have a USB key right here, so I'm good to go on that.
What a coincidence.
I know. It's almost like we planned that. The ISO image is, I said earlier, about 4.5 gigs. So the USB key needs to be big enough to hold that. They usually go in increments of 4 gigs, so you need like an 8 gig USB key or bigger. Mine, I believe, is 16. Yeah, 16 gigs. So I've got plenty of room on this one, but you'll just want one that's about 8 gigs or larger. Now, when we go to build this install media, whatever is on the USB key is going to get erased. So make sure that you've backed up anything that's on there that's important. I don't have anything important on mine. So let's go ahead and I'm hitting agree on my installer, so it'll continue moving on, and then we'll be ready to get this thing going. I'm going to plug in my USB key into my computer. So I've got that plugged in. Etcher is finishing its install. And I've already downloaded that ISO file. Let me go and show you my ISO file here that we've got. So right here. So you can see where I've downloaded CentOS 7 x86 64 DVD, and I've got a couple different ones. So let me explain the file name while I'm waiting on Etcher to finish. CentOS 7, this is version 7, right? So version 6 is the previous one. Earlier versions are no longer supported, so you should be running 6 or 7. x86_64. That's telling me that this is the 64-bit version of CentOS. If I saw 386 there, or i86, then that would tell me that it was a 32-bit version. Most computers these days are 64-bit architectures, so that's typically what we want. You noticed on the download page earlier, it didn't even give me a choice. The default option now is 64-bit,
Right.
and they're doing away with the 32-bit, so we want to make sure we don't use that. I did download the DVD install, not the minimal, and then right after that, you'll see a version number, okay? And the way the version numbers work is like this. The first two numbers are the year, and the second two numbers are the month. So this disk I downloaded back in April of 2018. This next disk is from October of 2018. Now, we're in March of 2019 when this is being filmed, so it's kind of old, isn't it? Well, they actually do releases on a 6-month cycle. So the releases come out every April and every October. So we're filming this in March. A new version is going to be coming out in April. So if you want to do the install at that point, you would see 1904. And then as the year goes on, then 1910. So that just kind of cycles over and over again. So since I have 1810, that's the newest one. That's the one that I actually want to put onto my USB key. All right, at this point, Etcher should be done. It is. And so Etcher finished its install, and so now I just see the 3 steps here. I need to select my image, pick my USB key, and then flash the disk. So I'm going to hit select image, and I'm going to browse right to that same ISO that I was just showing you. So we'll go into my folder here and choose it. All right. Next, I need to pick my USB device. Now, be careful on this. If you have more than one device attached to your computer, like I have a, at my desk, I have a terabyte drive that I do my backups on. If I pick that by accident, it's going to format my backup drive and then, well, copy the CentOS installer to it. So make sure you choose the right disk. I see that it's picked a 16 gig disk, which is my USB key, or 15.6, a little bit lower. So it's got that selected, and then I can just hit flash. And once I do that, let me just clarify that. There we go. Now it's starting. And the process to write is going to vary based on your machine. If you've got USB 3.0, it actually goes pretty quick. If you're on a USB 2.0 port, this can take a bit of time. Go get a cup of coffee, use the restroom, come back, you have to wait. But otherwise, it's going to copy that ISO image and put everything that we want right there on the USB key. And once that's done, we're actually ready to move in and do our install. So that's basically the last of the steps that we need to get ready to actually go and install CentOS.
Well, now that we're ready, how do we actually do the install?
All right. Well, we don't have to wait on my USB key. I can jump over here to another machine. Here we go. Once your USB key is done, right? Once it's finished, you put it in the new computer, or if it's, your existing laptop, you just reboot. And you're going to boot to the USB key. If it's a brand new computer with no operating system, it's going to boot right to this screen. If your computer already has an operating system, you've got to tell it to boot to the USB key. And that varies based on what computer you're on. On my computer, I have to hit the F6 key when it boots. Some computers like Dell, they usually do F11 on theirs. And that's a key that triggers it to say, show me a boot menu so that I can pick the USB key. And when you pick the USB key, then it's going to boot up and we're going to see this screen. Now, you'll notice it's not very flashy, and that's because it doesn't really know what video card I have yet. It can't do a full GUI, so I get a text-based screen. And we can't see here because it's a black screen, but it's actually not detecting my video card either. What it's doing is going in a 4:3 mode, so I actually have big black bars on the left and right that we don't see right now. We'll see those in a moment. Once it figures out what video card I have, then it'll stretch out and fill the rest of the screen. But for right now, we just get something very simple. And there's only a couple of options here for me. I can install CentOS, or I can test the media and then install. All right, what does test the media mean? Well, when you download 4.5 gigs of data from the internet, it's always possible that something could become damaged or corrupted. So it can test and look over the disk and say, let me make sure everything's okay before we do the install. That's really important if you only have one computer, right? Maybe I was running Windows right up until this moment, and I'm about to format it and do the install. Well, if I get halfway through the install and it hits a problem and crashes out, I've just killed my Windows install, and now I've got a bad CentOS install. Now I can't use my computer. So how am I supposed to go and re-download the ISO or fix my problem or whatever? I have to go somewhere else, use somebody else's network. If I have more than one computer, it's not a big deal, but if I've only got one, I'll definitely want to test that install media first. Now, in my case, when I used Etcher to burn it, Etcher actually does a secondary test to make sure everything wrote properly, so I know I'm good. So I'm going to skip that and just choose to install CentOS. And you can either press I on your keyboard or use your up and down arrows to highlight install CentOS 7. All right. After that, it's going to try and probe my video card, and it may actually find enough information to switch to a GUI. If it can't, then it's going to stay in a command line form, and I'm just going to see the text-based installer. So it's probing that video card right now, and in a moment, we should see it boot. Notice I've got a little boot. It just, in the top left, it just says boot, and it's waiting. This is it doing its probe there, mod probe. So that's where it's actually looking for hardware, and it's starting to find hardware. It's already adjusted my screen a little bit because it moved to a smaller font size, and then it's just kind of moving right through and checking to see what it can find. And any moment now, it is going to transition and start the installer. All right, and there we go. All right, if you see a mouse cursor like I did, that means it found enough of your video card to go to a GUI. So
yeah.
Here I am.
And it's graphical.
It is graphical, indeed. And we can see the black bars now too, right? So on the left and right side of my screen, I've got black bars because it doesn't know that I can do 16 by 9. It's doing 4 by 3. We'll see that kind of fix itself as the install goes on. All right, the first screen's just asking me what language I speak, right? So I can understand what I'm looking at. Defaults to English, which fortunately is what I speak, but if I spoke a different language, I would really want to find that so that I could actually navigate the rest of the menus. On the next screen, it's going to ask us a number of different questions in here, right? And each one is kind of related to a different function. The date and time. Having the correct date and time is really important for your system in order to be able to do things like authentication and encryption. They rely on having an accurate clock. So I can set that right here. It defaults to the New York time zone, which I'm in Florida, which happens to be in the same time zone as New York. So I kind of lucked out there. But if I wasn't, I could click on that and pick exactly which time zone I happen to be in and set what the time happens to be right now. You can also pick between a 24-hour and a 12-hour clock, which is always kind of a nice thing to do. All right. Now, it knows where I am, but the clock is actually wrong. It's not 5:21 a.m. I don't get up that early, but the date's right. It's going to synchronize with a network time server after this is all done. I can actually turn that on right here. See, network time is set to off. If I turn that on, it'll reach out and synchronize with the network time server. Now, in my case, it's not turning on. See how that switch is just dropping right back? Because I'm not connected to the network yet. So I'm going to leave that alone. We can actually fix the time later on. All right. Then I can go and adjust the keyboard if I chose wrong in that first screen and the language support. So that's kind of a repeat of what we already saw. The installation media, where are we actually installing from? Well, it says local media. We're installing from a USB key. In this case, you could install from the network or other locations. You could choose that right here. Then the software selection. Now, I did not download the minimal install. I downloaded the DVD, but it defaults to doing a minimal install anyway. You can pick and choose what it is that you want to install on your system. And when you click on that, you'll see a number of choices here based on the role of the system. How am I going to use it, right? Is this going to be a desktop? Is it going to be a server? And you'll see options in here for each of those. File and print server, infrastructure server, virtualization host, server with GUI, right? All of these are just different options for what we want to do. I'm going to come down and pick GNOME Desktop, all right? I'm going to use this as a desktop, so a regular person's computer. So they're going to expect a GUI. And there's two primary GUIs that are available in the Linux world, GNOME and KDE. There's probably 50 different ones that are out there, but those are the two most popular. GNOME is by far the most popular graphical user interface. So it's the one that you need to be familiar with for the exam. But even in real life, it's the one you need to know because it's the default for Ubuntu. It's the default for CentOS. They rely on GNOME. I have some other options that I can choose to install, things like commonly used GNOME applications, Office Suite, if I want to install OpenOffice and have that software available. You'll see other things in here that are tools that you may or may not need, system administration tools, and so on. You kind of pick and choose what you need. Now, there is internet applications. I'm going to check that one off because that gives me email, chat, but it's going to install a web browser regardless of what I choose here, so that's good because we kind of need that for a lot of what we do. But you pick and choose the software that you want, and once you've got that, you can go ahead and hit done, and now it knows that we're going to be installing more. It has to check to make sure that software is present on your install media, and once it checks, this will change to show that status is okay. Right now, it's a warning while it's inspecting. And while we're waiting on that, I can scroll down a little bit, and you'll see a few more options. Oop, I say we can scroll down. It won't let me. As soon as it's done doing its little check there, it'll scroll down. We can pick the installation destination. If you have more than one hard drive, you need to make sure you pick the right hard drive. And whoops, sorry, I clicked on security policy. There we go. Now I can scroll down.
Yay.
So the installation destination, that's going to be your hard drive. I've got my network that I wasn't able to connect to a moment ago. Now I can configure my network and a few other options. So let's get a couple of these set. I'm going to go to network, and I'm going to turn my network connection on. So it was off a moment ago. That was the time problem that I was having. So when I flip that on, if this were a wireless connection, I would have the option to choose a wireless SSID and get connected that way. But I just flipped on DHCP, connects to the network, ready to go. And in fact, I should be able to go up to my date and time now. Oh, and it's already flipped it on for me. So now it's happy with that. The other option was, let's see, KDump. KDump is the kernel dump. If you ever have a system crash, right, it'll try and do a memory dump of all the memory that was in use by the kernel at that time. It's really useful for developers who are troubleshooting. For regular end users, it's not very useful at all. In fact, it can be a little annoying sometimes. So if you know you're not going to use it, you can disable that functionality. It saves you something like a blazing 20 kilobytes of memory or something. It's not really a performance improvement, but if you know you're not going to use it anyway, it is something that you can turn off if you don't need it. That one's up to you. If you're a developer, you'll want to leave that on, though, for your troubleshooting tools. You can also set a security policy depending on how restrictive you want this machine to be. There is actually a default security policy that you can use that will basically just say, I want the standard permissions set as the CentOS team or the Red Hat team has decided. And notice here, we've got a little message that's including that Red Hat Enterprise Linux 7, because that's what this is based on. For me, I usually just choose one of the standard settings that are in here, right here. Standard system security profile for Red Hat Enterprise Linux 7. That just applies some basic protection so that regular users can't damage the system. And remember to hit the select profile button. I've done this before where you just click done and it doesn't actually set the profile. You have to hit select profile in order for it to do that, and it'll change the status down here to make that set. All right. Now it is warning me that because of the profile I've chosen, some things like the log messages need to be stored in a different location. And right now it's telling me I'm not set up for that. We haven't configured our disk, so I'm not going to worry about that just yet. I'll go ahead and hit done. It's telling me I've got a misconfiguration, and that's because I haven't set up my disk partitions yet. When you choose the installation destination, you pick which hard drive you want to install on. And it has the option to do a default layout to automatically configure partitioning. And if you leave that like it is, it's going to reach out, set up all of the space on your hard drive. It'll actually consume the entire hard drive if it can. I've got a 500 gig disk, so it'll use the whole thing, and it'll lay out the folders. You might not want to go with the default. You might want to change this and modify exactly what's going to be in each location. And you have a lot of flexibility with how you want to do that. If I choose the disk, well, mine's already chosen. So if I just check it again like that, all right, down at the bottom here, you'll see where I can choose to manually configure partitioning, okay? Or if you, like, let's say I had a Windows partition on there and I wanted to dual boot, you can choose, I would like to make additional space available. And you can shrink a Windows partition to make room to install Linux side by side. So you have kind of a couple of different options here. But configuring partitioning manually gives you total control over how this disk is going to be arranged and set up. And then down here, I can also choose to encrypt my data. You can encrypt the hard disk, and it's super easy to encrypt the hard disk right here. If you want to do it later on, it's actually really, really hard. So that's a decision that if you make it right now, will save you a ton of time and effort. And if this is a laptop, you'll typically want to encrypt it. If it's your desktop, it's up to you. It depends on how much you trust the physical security around your desktop, whether you need to encrypt that or not. Now, I want to take some time and go into the disk partitioning and kind of show how that all gets laid out. But I know I'm running low on time in this episode. So Zach, why don't we do a part two? Because I just want to spend a little time and show kind of what the default partitioning is that CentOS is going to set up, and show how we might choose to change that and modify it to meet our needs. And it's something that pops up on the test, so I want to make sure we spend a good bit of time on it.
Very good. Installing CentOS, and it's part one, and make sure you join us for part two inside of CompTIA Linux Plus. And before we move on, I sense that Don has something else you'd like to say.
Yeah, changing the partitions, that's not something that's required. It's up to you, but it is something that you definitely benefit from knowing about. And then keep in mind, we're doing installing CentOS right here. We're also going to do installing Ubuntu, so look for that episode. The process is similar but different. Different enough that we have to film it twice. So we'll get a chance to see that in a follow-up episode as well.
Thank you, Don. Well done. Make sure you see every episode of CompTIA Linux Plus. You're going to be so glad you did. And don't forget about the supplementary information that's available in our course library that'll help you be even more successful. So check that out, too. And tell everybody you know about IT Pro TV. IT Pro TV is binge-worthy. Thanks for watching. I'm Zach Memis.
And I'm Don Pizzette.
We will see you again soon.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.